In this video, I'm going to go over muscle structure and the function of the muscular system. Let's start by just highlighting what our muscles do for us. They have a number of important functions. Of course, muscles are involved in movement. They work with the skeletal system to allow us to do both gross movements with our whole body and also many small movements inside our body. Our muscles are necessary for posture, for holding us up when we stand or when we sit so we don't flop over. They are essential for generating the heat that makes us warm-blooded. Muscles, by their contraction, not only heat us, but also propel substances through the body. And finally, muscles serve as a nutrient reservoir, especially for proteins that may be needed for other functions within our body. Before I get into those functions in a little more detail, I want to cover some basics about muscle tissue. Remember that muscle tissue, one of the 4 types of tissue in the body, is the only tissue that can contract. It can shorten its size, and our muscle tissue comes in 3 different types. We have smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, found only in the heart, and skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of many of the hollow organs in our body, including our blood vessels and even a little bit in our skin. Smooth muscle is involuntary, the control is not conscious, and the cells are spindle-shaped. That means they're pointed on the ends with a single nucleus. The fibers that cause these muscle cells to contract are connected in a network pattern, which allows the cells to contract in many directions instead of only one. There are 2 different types of smooth muscle as it comes to how they are organized. We see the spindle-shaped cells over here in the 2 types. The first type is called multi-unit smooth muscle, and this is one where you have individual cells that can contract on their own. This is where you get a very small movement. One of the places we see these multi-unit smooth muscle is in the erector pili muscles that we have in our hair follicles. That's what causes our hair to stand on end when we're cold. And so these are very, very small movements, just really one cell can contract at a time. The contrast to that, you have the visceral smooth muscle where you actually have sheets of muscle cells where the cells contract as a group because of cross-communication that's happening between these smooth muscle cells. This type of smooth muscle is what you need to perform steady, slow contractions, and it's the kind that's found inside the organs of your body, such as your stomach and intestine, to move the food along as you go through the digestive process. Cardiac muscle, as I mentioned, is located only in the heart, and it is striated in appearance. It has light and dark bands, so under a good microscope, you can see stripes actually in the muscle. The muscle fibers, again, contract as a unit, and communication occurs across a structure called intercalated discs, and that allows communication to flow more quickly between muscle cells so that all of the heart functions the way it needs to. Cardiac muscle is self-exciting. That means it will contract without a message from your brain, so it'll keep up a rhythmic contraction on its own, even in a laboratory situation. If you have some cardiac muscle cells in a petri dish, they show a rhythmic contraction. The third type of muscle, skeletal muscle, is the type that's attached to bone and is under voluntary control. Like cardiac muscle, it is striated. It has distinctive light and dark stripes or bands, and it's multinucleated. The muscle cells are actually quite large when it comes to cells, very, very long, and can have many nuclei in it to help control the processes that keep them healthy and allow your muscles to contract. Skeletal muscle is heavily organized, and we'll go through that in a minute. The muscle cells, which are sometimes called muscle fibers, are first grouped into bundles that are called fascicles. So that's the first level of organization, from a muscle cell or muscle fiber into a bunch of fibers making a fascicle. Skeletal muscles themselves are organs because they contain several types of tissue. You not only have the skeletal muscle tissue that does the contraction, but you have nervous tissue that sends the signal that it's time to contract. You have blood vessels to bring in oxygen to help power that contraction and take away the carbon dioxide, and lots of connective tissue around the whole muscle. We call this connective tissue around our muscles fascia. You may have heard of plantar fasciitis, which is an inflammation of the connective tissue on the bottom of the foot. And the connective tissue actually wraps bundles of muscle fibers at various levels. We have mysium as the suffix that means muscle. So we have epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium for the different levels of the connective tissue wrapping. Fascia can be further divided into two types. There's aponeurosis and, of course, tendons, which you're already familiar with. Tendons are the narrow bands or ropes of connective tissue that bring muscles to bone. But aponeuroses are important too. They are flatter, bigger sheets of connective tissue that also can attack muscles to bone or can attach one muscle to another muscle. So a couple places where you see aponeuroses in the body are on the top of the head where you have no muscles, but you have this connective tissue that takes the muscles in the front and connects it to the muscles in the back. And then, of course, in the abdominal area, there are lots of places where you can see there's just this white connective tissue, no distinct muscles, but that connective tissue needs to tie the muscles together. So this page gives us several pictures that show this level of organization in the skeletal muscle. So we start down here with a muscle fiber or a cell. We can see it's coming out of a bundle. That bundle, of course, is a fascicle. And inside each muscle cell, we see the red dots that represent the contractile fibers that you'll be learning about, along with other important structures such as a nucleus and the sarcolemma, which is the fancy word for the cell membrane when you're talking about a muscle cell, many mitochondria to power the contraction, and then a wrapping of connective tissue, the endomysium, around an individual muscle cell. So each muscle cell is wrapped with a layer of connective tissue. Also, next to the muscle cells, we have the muscle stem cells, known as myosatellite cells, that are there to help repair the muscle and rebuild any protein fibers that might be broken down. Then if you put several of these muscle fibers together, you make a muscle fascicle. So that's the next level up. So we see our fascicle here. So inside of it, you have all these individual muscle fibers with their individual nuclei being shown in the cross section. And all of those, of course, are wrapped in an endomysium. But then the fascicle is wrapped in connective tissue. So that's the perimysium. And then going one step further, we're taking multiple fascicles and putting them together in your muscle. And so you can see individual fascicles here that are full of muscle cells or muscle fibers. Nerves are coming in to provide the impulse for contraction. You have blood vessels to supply oxygen and take away carbon dioxide. Each individual fascicle is wrapped around with a perimysium. Each individual cell is wrapped with the endomysium. And then the whole muscle is wrapped with the epimysium. Along with holding all the muscle cells in a proper arrangement, all of the wrapping with connective tissue helps the parts of your muscle to sort of slide past each other because not every muscle cell is going to contract at the same time. And so you want the muscles to kind of move freely. The parts that are shortening will move freely against the parts that are not. And the connective tissue helps reduce friction and allows that to happen. Here's an electron microscope, again looking very closely at one of these muscle fibers in here in a fascicle. You may think you have seen muscle fibers if you think about what meat looks like because you kind of recognize the shape, but actually you're looking at the upper level, you're looking at fascicles bundled together, not muscle fibers themselves when you're looking at the food that you cook. Inside an individual muscle fiber, you have filaments of protein known as myofilaments. And these are what actually do the contracting. And we'll have a second video on how this whole contractile system works, how actin and myosin are arranged and are activated to contract. But just to kind of introduce it, I just wanted to let you know that the contractile unit inside a muscle cell is called a sarcomere. And when the muscle contracts, individual sarcomeres shorten. What's happening is that there is a section of the sarcomere that can move towards each other. So it's going to move in from either side and shorten up the whole sarcomere. And when you have many, many sarcomeres all shortening, the entire muscle will then contract. But you'll hear more about this in another video. So I want to finish by going through the functions in a little more detail. The first function of your muscular system is, of course, movement and posture. And you already know that muscles are attached to bones, and tendons are usually what is doing that. And these muscles also are typically attaching to a bone across one of the many joints in your body. The joints allow the bones to move when the muscles do the contraction. Many of these muscle, joint, and bone arrangements are actually a class 3 lever, which is the type of lever where a little contraction can cause a lot of movement. If you think about how much your hand can move when your biceps contract, and obviously your muscle is shortening, but it is not shortening the same distance as your hand can be as it moves from being out straight to being up touching your shoulder. You also have many, many muscles that are involved in posture. They're found deep in your back, throughout your abdomen and your pelvis, and they help maintain an upright position, whether you're standing or sitting, without you having to consciously think about it. This next slide shows you some of the places where we have these levers in our body, and whether they're first, second, or third class, which is really all about what's the relationship between the fulcrum, or the point of bending, and the load. And as I said here, here's our third class, which is very common and allows a great deal of movement without very much contraction occurring. The second function of muscles is to generate heat. Muscles use ATP during contractions because ATP is the energy source for our bodies, and you need energy if you're going to have movement. Remember, motion is evidence that energy has been expended. ATP is broken down into ADP and excess P. And whenever chemical bonds are broken, you have heat being produced as a waste product. So as ATP is used, it is broken down. As it is broken down, heat is given off. Cellular respiration is the process that makes ATP by combining this ADP and the extra Ps, and heat is produced again as a waste product, because whenever you have a chemical reaction, heat is either going to be absorbed or released, and cellular respiration releases a lot of waste heat. So both of these processes, using the ATP to power muscle contraction and using cellular respiration to make more ATP to power more muscle contraction, are things that make your body become warmer during exercise. And this particular process, the contraction of our muscles, is part of what contributes to us being warm-blooded animals. The muscular system is also important for propelling substances. So as I mentioned, your smooth muscle contractions can move food through the GI tract. They move sperm and eggs through the reproductive system, and they move urine down through the urinary system to the bladder and to the outside world. Muscle contraction, also just bodily muscle contractions, help return blood to the heart and move lymph through lymphatic vessels that run beside blood vessels. And so it's important for things to be able to move around your body. You have to have your muscular system to keep things moving. This illustration just shows what happens as things are being moved down a tube, like going from your esophagus into your stomach. You have areas where muscles are contracting above and relaxing below, and so then the food can be sent in a downward direction, squeeze by squeeze. And finally, your muscles serve as a nutrient reserve or a nutrient reservoir for two important nutrients. First, they are a site for storing excess glucose as glycogen. Remember, glycogen is the polysaccharide that is a glucose storage molecule in animals. The liver is also a place where glycogen is stored, but it's especially important to have glycogen present in the muscle because it can be very easily grabbed and used in cellular respiration for making more ATP as those muscles are demanding it for contraction. And then muscle is a reservoir of amino acids because muscle is protein. Protein is made of amino acids. And the amino acids in your muscles may be released if you need proteins elsewhere in the body and you've not had sufficient protein intake. So it is important to be eating protein throughout the day because your body will be needing to make protein throughout the day. So finally, do an individual check for understanding. Can you discuss how the muscular system performs each of its key functions? Can you describe the key characteristics of each type of muscle tissue? And can you also describe how connective tissue and muscle tissue work together to produce functioning muscles? If you're not sure about the answers, go back and find those sections in the video and listen again.